I had a teacher in high school who told the best stories. And let me tell you, he told some whoppers. What made him such a great storyteller was that you couldn't tell which ones were real and which ones weren't. I mean, he talked about killing a bear with his bare hands on the way to school. That's how he talked. And he talked about taking the bear home and cooking it for supper. Or that time he and his brother, they caught the whole barn on fire. And one whole wall went up in flames. And then his brother put his hands on his hips and he blew the fire out with just his mouth. Or the time his daughter and he were out dove hunting. And she went to shoot the bird, but she shot a branch by the bird, and the branch flew off through the bird and killed it that way, all because she had planned it that way. He was great. We're going to begin our third series in this The Stories God Tells series. And let me tell you, the story of Jonah seems like quite a whopper itself. Let me warn you before we dig in that it's tempting to chalk this up as a made-up story with made-up people to prove a point. And you can call me crazy if you want, but I believe the story of Jonah. Jonah was a real person. In fact, in 2 Kings chapter 14, they identified Jonah as a real person. And Jesus pointed to Jonah in this story in Matthew chapter 12. This is a real story, real history that God is giving us, and it has real application to our lives today. Chapter 2, which we'll look at next week, is what most people point to as the hardest part of the Jonah story to swallow. Pun intended. Wait till next week and you'll get it. I'm going to suggest the hardest thing to believe is actually in chapter 1. God gives Jonah a charge to go to the city of Nineveh and deliver a message of repentance. Jonah doesn't want to, and here's the hard part for me to believe, or at least the most far-fetched part. Jonah flees from God. How do you flee from God? I mean, seriously, how does somebody run and flee from the all-knowing, omnipotent, all-seeing creator of the universe? Seems like a pretty far-fetched idea to me. And yet Jonah did, or he tried to, and I think we often do too. We try to run from God. We try to flee from what God has called us to do. The problem is, I think we often get so fixated on wanting God to call us to a place or a big specific job or a big call that we forget what God has already called us to, and we run from the call of God in our lives. As we begin this story of Jonah, you're going to read and dig into some pretty crazy things. But the craziest thing of all might just be how much we relate to Jonah, even if we don't want to admit it. It already begins in chapter 1 this week. God tells Jonah to go and share the message he has given him to people who need to hear it. We can relate. Jonah doesn't want to do this, and he attempts to run away from God and what he's called him to do. And I think more than we'd like to admit, we can relate. We don't share the gospel with the person we see every day. Or we don't reach out to the people who are different than us or who don't really like us, or if we're being honest, we don't really like. We don't love all people the way Jesus loved us. We don't love them and go to them as he's called us to love them. We run from being kind, from showing grace, from listening to people who disagree with us or are different than us. We run. And God pursues Jonah. And God won't give up on Jonah that easily. He does the same to you and me. Tonight, we jump into a short 4-chapter story of Jonah, but there's much for us to learn from this man named Jonah. So don't be too quick to judge the prophet who ran from God, and don't be too quick to assume that you and I are that much different. Some of you are jumping into this study and you can completely relate to Jonah. You got no desire to do what God's calling you to do, or maybe you have no desire to listen to anything that God has to say. And all of this is kind of new to you, or maybe you just showed up to your small group Bible study tonight because a friend brought you and promised you some free snacks. I want to invite you, if that's you, to commit to the next 4 weeks. Be willing for 4 weeks, just 4 weeks, to listen to what God has to say. For 4 weeks, just be open to what God might want to change and soften in your heart. And maybe you're here and you're jumping into your group tonight in this study and you can't believe anybody would be stupid enough to try to run from God and so openly disobey and refuse to follow God's direction as Jonah is. I want to invite you to pause for a moment too. And I want to invite you also to commit the next 4 weeks to be willing to listen to what God might say to you. To be open for the next 4 weeks to what he might reveal about you, what he might convict you of, and that he might soften your heart too. You see, the other thing that you and Jonah and I have in common is that God has a message for us to deliver. And if you're a follower of Jesus, He's commanded us to give it. That will never change, no matter how far you run, how much you try to hide. So let's jump in.